A shy girl, working as a waitress at a $1 million gala, collapses from exhaustion and wakes up in a lavish penthouse beside a man who once slept beneath bridges and now wears the quiet armor of wealth. He recognizes her. By a birthmark, she spent her whole life hiding. Sometimes the kindness you gave away, soft, unnoticed, comes back to find you, and when it does, it saves you in the gentlest way. The ballroom shimmered with the glow of 100 chandeliers, casting soft light over the velvet hush of jazz floating beneath the vaulted ceiling. It spilled gently through the room, brushing against glittering evening gowns and the delicate clink of crystal glasses, like wind chimes stirred by a breeze. Laughter drifted easily from manicured mouths, the sort of sound that belonged to the upper crust, effortless and well-practiced. In the middle of it all, Leora moved slowly, both hands gripping a tray of champagne flutes. The tight black uniform clung to her body, each step measured, cautious, as if a single deep breath might shatter her. Sweat soaked the collar of her dress. Her right hand twitched subtly, an unconscious urge to tug the sleeve down farther, to hide the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist, faint in color but steeped in memories of a childhood spent in hiding. Just make it through tonight, she whispered to herself, her eyes lowered, never meeting another's. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, surrounded by opulence, by voices honed by privilege and power. But debts didn't care about dreams. Bills didn't. Pause for shame. And Leora needed this job, even if only for a night. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed off the last flute of champagne to a guest near the stage. He didn't even glance at her. As she turned away, her elbow brushed against the arm of an older woman stepping backward. In that instant, time cracked. The tray tipped. Glasses toppled. Champagne spilled like gold across the marble. And then the sound, fragile, crystalline, of glass shattering beneath stilettos. Every head turned. Leora didn't meet a single gaze. She bowed her head, stepped back, lips forming an apology that never made it past the dryness in her throat. The room blurred. A wave of dizziness surged through her, fast, fierce, and final, and then she fell. The sound of her body hitting the ground was soft but unmistakable in the silence, where the music had just skipped a beat. A silver moon pendant flew from her neck, tumbling across the polished floor, spinning until it came to a quiet stop at the feet of a man standing alone near the podium, Kalen Montclair. His hand had just touched the microphone when he heard the crash, but it was the delicate clink of metal against stone that drew his eyes downward. Kalen froze. He bent to pick it up, his fingers closing around the cool silver as though brushing against something half-forgotten, half-dreamed. His gaze fixed on the pendant, a simple disc scuffed at the left edge. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, strange, uncertain, but piercing. "This," he murmured, not knowing if he was speaking to himself or someone far away. Behind him, a server rushed to lift Leora from the floor. An older woman clucked her tongue and said, "Poor thing must have passed out." Kalen didn't turn. He stood where he was, gripping the necklace like a lifeline to some distant memory, something he'd once lost, now returned in the quietest way. Morning light spilled through sheer voile curtains, casting pale gold streaks across the polished wood table. The room was unfamiliar, yet warm, like something conjured from a dream that didn't belong to Leora, a place untouched by hurried footsteps, landlords shouting, or the sour mildew of old bedsheets. The scent of lavender brushed gently against her nose, like a hand reaching out in kindness. And yet it made her wary. Leora opened her eyes, disoriented by the softness of the blanket covering her, fabric smoother than anything that had ever touched her skin. She pushed herself upright, then froze. The room didn't resemble anywhere she'd ever been. Ivory walls, floor-to-ceiling glass doors opening onto a balcony that faced a city just beginning to wake. On the small side table, a still warm glass of water sat beside a crystal vase holding a few sprigs of purple lavender. It was all too peaceful, so peaceful, it made her uneasy. She clenched her hands. At once, she tugged her right sleeve down, covering the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist, a reflex as old as breath. The door on the left opened. Kaelan stepped in, stripped of the polished sheen the world usually saw in him. Just a rolled-up shirt, and those eyes, deep, steady, watching her not like a man facing a stranger, but someone trying to recall a story he once lived and nearly forgot. Leora instinctively pulled back, her spine taut. I have to go." Her voice was quiet but firm, dry like winter wind. She gathered the blanket around herself and swung her legs off the bed, bare feet meeting the cool wood floor like stepping into a still lake. "You're not hurt," Kaelan said, unmoving. "Just fainted from exhaustion. I brought you back and I don't need anyone's pity," she cut in, her fingers gripping her opposite wrist as though bracing a fragile shell she'd worn for years just to survive. Kaelan nodded, as if he recognized the armor. Had seen it before. He walked to the table, picked up an envelope he'd left there, and placed it at the edge of the bed. "This is the hospital bill. If you need help—" "I don't need anything," she said again, not angrily this time, but with a kind of quiet sorrow. A sadness turned inward, not loud, but echoing in her chest like an unanswered knock. The silence stretched between them, tight as a string pulled too far. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the envelope, as if it marked the line. Between freedom and a weakness she'd fought her whole life to bury. Never before had she felt so out of place, not even in the orphanage dorms she grew up in. There, at least, she'd never had to question whether kindness came with a cost. Leora stepped to the table, bowed her head slightly, and her fingers brushed the silver moon pendant at her neck. The cool touch of metal steadied her, a quiet anchor to remind her she was awake, still herself. She said nothing more, just a small nod, not of gratitude, but of refusal, the kind that turns away an unspoken offer, and then she walked toward the door. It opened. The air was sharp, the light uneven. Kaelan didn't stop her. He only watched, and his gaze landed right where the edge of her sleeve had slipped for a moment, revealing the faint crescent birthmark on her wrist, pale as moonlight on still water. But this time, he didn't ask. He didn't move. He only stood there, silent, as if something had been confirmed within him, something he wasn't yet ready to name. If it were you, waking up in a place of quiet luxury, carrying the weight of old wounds, would you trust kindness or run from it? Tell us what you do in the comments below. Whose side are you on, Leora's or Kaelan's? Leaving the penthouse felt like stepping out of a strange dream, one stitched together from someone else's longing. Leora walked slowly, her steps feather-light, as if afraid of waking something in herself that had begun to stir. The streets were still half asleep, the city drowsy in the early hush. But inside her, everything had snapped back to its old rhythm. The rhythm of days with no one waiting, nothing owed, and nothing left to lose but herself. She passed 2 intersections, her soft shoes soaked through from dew clinging to the pavement. The bus stop on the corner hadn't lit up yet. Moss-covered walls led her back to the boarding house she knew by shape, by scent, musty, tired. The warped iron door on the ground floor still rattled with its worn-out lock. Just as she touched the latch, the landlady's voice came from behind the curtain. "You should pack up, Leora. It's been 3 days. I can't hold the room anymore." There was no anger in her voice, just the flat, weary indifference of someone who'd grown too used to saying no. Leora stood still, then nodded, said nothing and turned away. The sun had vanished behind a bank of low, ash-grey clouds. Wind slipped down the collar of her coat. At the corner where the sidewalk was slick with moss, she sat down on a low concrete step. The world around her seemed held in suspension, quiet save for the wind humming through a rusted wire fence, a strange, warped tune that sounded like a song no one had written. Her canvas bag slid off her shoulder. A small tear opened at the corner. She didn't notice. Instead, she pulled a white envelope from inside her coat, the one she hadn't meant to open. But now, with nothing else to hold on to, She found she couldn't stop herself from looking at it. Like staring at a door you don't believe in, but still hope might open. She tore it open, a hospital bill, and a small folded piece of paper. The words inside were plain, no flattery, no preamble. If you want real work, I always need someone like you, no name, just a phone number. Leora stared at the digits for a long time, didn't read them aloud. But they etched themselves into her eyes, sharp and quiet. She clenched the note and tore it in half. The sound of paper ripping was soft, like a whisper swallowed before it could form. "I don't need anyone," she said, her voice brittle, rasping like dry wind through a broken window. She didn't cry. It had been years since tears came easy, but her hand trembled, just slightly, so faint it was almost invisible, until she reached to tug her sleeve back up and the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist came into view. She looked at it, as if seeing it for the first time, as if it were something foreign that had just appeared, not on her skin, but from a place in her memory long forgotten. Mist began to fall. Light, cold drops, not a downpour, not a storm, just a fine rain, like the tears of someone who had stopped crying long ago. No, one stopped beside her. No one asked, no one knew who she was. And maybe that was what scared her most, that after everything, she was still just a quiet name, untethered, unmarked, not worth remembering. But somewhere inside her, a voice echoed from earlier that, "Morning." Not loud, not clear, just a distant, flickering echo. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. If you need help, I always need someone like you." She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to let the noise inside her stop for a while. Just for a while. The rain hadn't come in a rush, but it was relentless. Each drop, fine as breath, soaked through layers of fabric and settled into the skin, drawing out a cold that was quiet, deep. The city, nearing dusk, had lost its bustle. Sounds grew dull, smudged beneath the steady patter on aging rooftops and streets flecked with trembling reflections. Leora sat alone on a park bench, darkened by time and moss. There was nowhere left to go, no one left to call. The cousin she had once pinned her final hope on had offered nothing but a hesitant, apologetic reply. "I'm struggling too, sweetheart." She didn't feel anger, not disappointment either. Just a sense of being the last page in an unfinished book, one no one bothered to read. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks. Rain stung her eyes, but she didn't blink it away. There were no tears, hadn't been in a long time. Crying, she'd learned, was a luxury for those who still had hope. And Leora had learned silence instead, the kind that settles in your chest when nothing more can be held. She curled inward. Beneath her thin coat, legs pulled up on the bench, arms wrapped around her knees, as if she might fold into herself, disappear. Her hand slipped down to her right wrist, resting on the crescent-shaped birthmark that had faded over time, but never, not once, in meaning. "Mom would have told me not to be so stubborn," she murmured into the wind and rain, her voice vanishing, like smoke through her fingers. She didn't know how long she stayed there, but then a flicker of lavender on the air. Soft, out of place in the dampness, she lifted her head. A black umbrella eclipsed the sky above her, stopping the rain on her face. Someone stood there, tall, still. The wind tugged at their coat, but the umbrella didn't waver. And those eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, looked at her with a kind of quiet recognition that unsettled her more than anything else. Kalen said nothing at first. He simply held the umbrella above her, as if waiting for something unspoken, to rise or settle. The rain kept falling around them, wrapping them in a sheer curtain that dimmed the world outside. Then his gaze dropped to her right wrist, where the birthmark, pale and trembling with cold, lay exposed. His eyes lingered there, long enough for time to go still in the space between them, and then softly, like the final piece of a dream slipping into place, he said, "That birthmark, it's you." His voice cracked in the rain, gentle and hoarse. "You're the little girl who shared her bread with me under the bridge, aren't you?" Leora's eyes widened. The wind quieted. The cold inside her pulled back, replaced by something stranger. Not fear, not surprise, but a sensation like being reeled backward through time into a memory so old it no longer had edges. A girl of 8, a piece of bread, broken in half. A boy beside her, dirty, shivering, and his eyes quiet, yearning, human, in a city too used to turning away. Those same eyes now stared at her from the face of a grown man in a suit and silence, carrying the same light, the same ache. She didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked, and in that stillness the rest of the world fell away. The rain, the bench, the park, the city itself blurred to a hush. Only 2 people remained, face to face in the clearing of recognition. No confirmation needed, no proof asked, no more questions. Just one quiet truth standing between them, and everything that would come after. Leora didn't ask where he was taking her, and when he said softly, "Let's go home," she didn't resist, as if they'd done this before, though in truth they had barely looked each other in the eye until now. She sat beside him, in the car, simple, immaculate, not the kind of vehicle that reeked of leather or expensive cologne like she'd imagined from those who lived on the other side. There was only the faint, familiar scent of lavender and silence. When they arrived, she stepped once more into that penthouse, bathed in the same gentle amber light as before. Quiet. Warm. But this time, it didn't feel unfamiliar. Maybe because she was drenched, shivering, and too tired to hold up the walls she'd built for years, she sank onto the long couch by the window, hands clutching at the hem of her shirt, rain still clinging to her hair in soft beads. He offered her a towel. She didn't take it. Her left hand held tight to her right wrist, covering the crescent birthmark as if protecting it from view. But Kaelan saw, and this time, he didn't look away. He sat across from her, not too close, but near enough for her to feel that. In that moment, she wasn't entirely alone. It was a long while before he spoke, only when the rhythm of rain outside had settled into a quiet, steady beat. "I used to think," he began, voice soft as breath, "that if I ever got the chance, I'd find the person who gave me a reason to keep going, even if back then she was just a little girl." Leora didn't look at him, but something in her posture stilled, as if she knew, deep in the marrow of her being, that what came next would change something in her. "That year," he went on, as if telling a story to himself, "I was 9. My mother had died. My father had vanished. I lived under a bridge on the south edge of this city, surviving on what I could steal or beg. No one stopped, no one asked. Until one day, a girl with tangled hair and a worn-out coat sat down next to me and handed me half a piece of bread." Kaelan stared at the space between them, eyes distant like watching an old film through fogged glass. She didn't ask who I was. Didn't care if I had anything to give back. She just said, "The sun will rise tomorrow." Then she walked away. But when she turned, she dropped something. His gaze drifted to the silver moon pendant at her throat, softly gleaming in the light. I picked it up. I kept it for 3 years. When I was finally taken into a shelter, I gave it to the man running inventory, but I never forgot the girl, or her words. Leora said nothing. Her fingers brushed the pendant, a touch so faint it could have vanished with one breath. "This necklace," she whispered, her voice catching, "was the last thing my mother gave me. I lost it once and didn't know where I looked everywhere for it." Kaelan nodded. "That's how I knew it was you." The silence between them no longer felt hollow. It was a bridge now, spanning years, memories, the ache of 2, souls that had once collided beneath a world too busy to care. Something in Leora buckled, not in breaking, but in softening. A wall inside her gave its first quiet sigh. She looked at him, really looked, for the first time that evening. Her voice, when it came, was low, almost afraid of the answer. "And you made it through because of what I said?" Kaelan smiled, a small, sorrowful smile, but deep and warm like a night without rain. "No. I made it through because—" "You said it," the quiet returned, but this time it held the sound of a heartbeat, and Leora no longer covered her wrist. The silence that followed Kaelan's story didn't dissolve the way Leora had hoped. It didn't drift away like mist or fall away like the final drop of a storm. It lingered, filling the room, curling into corners, settling into the spaces, between her ribs, into the places she thought she had long since locked shut. He didn't ask anything of her, didn't move closer, didn't reach for her hand. He simply sat there across from her like someone waiting for the wind to deliver a reply. His gaze stayed steady, never pleading, never pushing, but unwavering. A kind of patience she hadn't known still existed. A kind that felt real. Leora stood, as if something inside her had stirred awake, a force she couldn't yet name, rising not in defense, but in resistance. Her voice, when it came, no longer carried the brittle edge she used on landlords or strangers in the rain. It trembled, soft, raw, like the one feeling she'd always been most afraid of becoming. "You only say that because you pity me." Kaelan didn't flinch, didn't argue. He didn't scramble to explain like men often did when faced with the fragile weight of a woman's pain. Instead, he looked at her, deeply, steadily, and then raised a hand to his chest, placing it gently over his heart. "No one holds on to a memory for 15 years, he said, voice low, textured like wood worn smooth by time, just out of pity. Another silence bloomed between them. Leora took a step back, but this time not to retreat, more like testing the ground beneath her, checking the direction of her own heart. She reached up to her neck, to the silver moon pendant still, resting against her skin, and traced its cool curve. Once it had been her comfort. Now it felt more like a knock, soft, insistent, on a door inside her. Then she looked at him. Truly looked, and in her eyes the defenses had quieted. The mistrust that had sharpened her voice for so long began to crack, like paint under sun, or ice giving way to the first breath of spring. "I've spent most of my life being unneeded," she said, her voice no louder than rain against glass. "So when someone wants to stay, I don't know what to do with that." Kaelan didn't speak. He only rose to his feet, stepped slowly toward her, and with great care adjusted the chain at her collarbone, as if fixing a sleeve or smoothing a wrinkle. His fingers never touched her skin, but he stood close enough that she could hear her own heartbeat, not anxious, not entirely trusting. Just alive. She didn't step back, and when his hand dropped, their eyes met again, this time with nothing held back, no debts, no gratitude. Just two people who had once been broken, standing in the space between what was and what might still be if they allowed it. Leora drew in a deep breath. Her hands fell to her sides, no longer clutching the sleeve of her right arm. The crescent-shaped birthmark glowed in the soft gold of the lamplight, clear, quiet, at peace. Not something to hide, but something she was willing finally to let be seen. Neither of them spoke. But in that still room, where the rain had long stopped and the real moon had begun to climb the window pane, something had begun. Not love. Not in the way people usually mean, but something gentler, braver, the kind of feeling that makes a person unbutton the coat they've worn too long and let themselves be seen, without apology. The morning sky wasn't clear, but light poured through the layers of clouds like streams of milk, quiet, steady, enough to let the city know a new day had begun. Leora stood before the headquarters of the Revive Foundation, a modest, beautiful building tucked discreetly at the edge of the financial district. She took a deep breath before stepping inside, clutching a thin folder against her chest. Not a job application, not a thank you letter, but a design. Her steps weren't rushed, but they were firmer than ever before. The hallway that led to Kaelan's office glowed with the same soft light she remembered from the penthouse that first morning. But this time, she was no longer a lost visitor. She knocked. 3 short taps. Kaelan looked up from his desk, his gaze still calm and composed, but there was something softer at the corners of his eyes, as if he'd been waiting for her all this time, never certain she'd come. Leora didn't sit right away. She walked to his desk, opened her folder, and slid out a single thick sheet, printed in full color. A logo. "I heard the foundation still doesn't have an official emblem," she said, her voice even. And if you're still looking for a designer, this is me." She pushed the page toward him. It was a simple design, but enough to make someone pause. A soft crescent moon nestled within an open circle, not closed, not sealed, but reaching outward. Below it, the words, "Revive with kindness." Kalen picked it up, saying nothing at first. No flattery, no theatrics, just a quiet nod. His eyes lingered on the open circle, a small detail, but one he knew wasn't accidental. "This," he said after a moment, his voice low, "looks a lot like your pendant." "Because it's inspired by it," she replied. "By something that never fully closed, and maybe doesn't need to." They were quiet again, but not with the kind of silence that weighed down a room. This was the silence of two people who understood what needed to be understood, without saying it aloud. No one mentioned. The night before, no one reached back to the memory from 15 years ago. Leora hadn't come to ask for help. She came to offer something, of herself, of her talent, of the worth she'd once believed she didn't have. Kalen didn't offer his hand, didn't ask her to sit, didn't say he was proud of her or that she'd changed. He simply laid the design on the desk with care, as if placing down the start of something, a partnership. At last, Leora sat, not as a guest, not as someone in debt, but as a collaborator, someone choosing to stay, not out of romance, but from something quieter, steadier. Gratitude, trust, and the shared desire to build something that mattered. She no longer needed to be loved to feel worthy. And maybe, because of that, she was finally beginning to understand how to love, and how to be loved in a way that heals. The city sky glowed bright the morning after the long night of rain. No snow, no harsh sun, just a lightness in the air, clean and quiet, as if even the weather was cautiously opening itself to something new. Inside the grand hall of the pool, Community Cultural Center, the crowd was thick, reporters, sponsors, and faces often seen in financial magazines. All eyes were fixed on the stage, where Kalen Montclair, once dubbed the cold mind of medical tech markets, stood calm beneath the lights. But today, there were no projections, no growth models or strategic forecasts. Today, Kalen didn't look up to the vaulted ceiling as he usually did, but straight ahead, his gaze steady, grounding. Now and then it flickered softly toward the right wing of the stage, just off camera. His voice rose, clear, measured, and unmistakably his. "Today, I officially stepped down from my role at Montclair Biomedical." A murmur swept through. The crowd, sharp and immediate, like a bell dropped at high noon. Cameras flashed, but Kalen didn't pause. His tone never faltered. "I'm not retiring," he continued. "I'm simply choosing a different path, one I postponed too long for things I once believed mattered more." Behind him, a curtain lifted, revealing the name, Revive Foundation, healing through kindness. Backstage, Leora stood at an angle, watching. She wore a simple knee-length dress, hair tied low, a small notebook in hand. She wasn't dressed to be seen, but to belong. And in the whirlwind of attention, she remained the quiet axis around which everything spun, as though this moment existed in part because of her. When Kalen stepped down, he didn't pose for the press and he didn't wave. He simply walked, unhurried, intentional, toward the side stage. He stopped in front of her. Under the blaze of lights and the noise of questions shouted from the crowd, a quiet space formed around them, just big enough for two. Leora looked at him steady. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice so soft it barely reached him. "Giving all this up for a promise made years ago?" Kalen held her gaze for a beat, then shook his head, not to reject the question, but to reshape it. "No," he said. "I'm not giving it up. I'm continuing it, but this time with the only person who never asked anything from me." They stood there a little longer. A camera turned toward them, catching the moment. No hand-holding, no embrace, no kiss, just the closeness between them. The way they stood, not touching, not performing, but undeniably tethered. The kind of connection that doesn't beg for attention, yet draws every eye. In the frame, they walked, side by side, toward the back exit of the hall, out into the softening light, where the air was warmer and footsteps didn't echo quite so loud. No one said love, no proposal, no grand romance, just two people who had once been broken, who had once survived alone, now choosing to walk together, not as a condition, but as a choice. Long after, people argued about it. Some said, he gave up everything for a poor girl who once gave him half a loaf of bread. Others said, it wasn't about her. It was about the kindness that saved him, and the moment. He chose to live in service of it. But only the two of them knew the truth. They weren't lovers, Mas, not yet. They were simply two human beings healing each other, and sometimes that's enough to begin. Do you believe a small act of kindness can change a life? If this story touched you, like the video and subscribe to the channel, so we can keep sharing stories that remind us kindness never disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to return. The introverted girl dozed off on the train and woke up in a place she didn't recognize, facing a young millionaire hiding from the world after a fall from grace. Amid the hush of snow and silence, they found each other in the things they'd never dared to say. And if a trembling voice could thaw a frozen heart, who then was saving whom? The train rolled through the endless darkness of the suburbs. Pale yellow lights from the carriage flickered against the fogged windows, streaking across the glass like blurred memories. Leora sat still by the window, her head lightly resting. Against the pane, eyes half closed. The phone in her hand lit up one final time, a brief message appearing on the screen. We regret to inform you. The manuscript does not meet our publication standards. She wasn't the author. She was only the editor, the one who had quietly believed in the manuscript, shaped it, pinned her hopes to it as if it could speak the words she never dared to say. A small part, but enough to leave her breathless. The disappointment wasn't new. It had settled in so long ago that now it drew no reaction, just a soundless sigh, and the phone flipped face down onto her lap. Sometimes the exhaustion didn't come from work. It came from the effort of not disappearing entirely. Leora closed her eyes, letting the train's steady hum lull her like a distant lullaby. Snow had started falling outside. She couldn't see it, but felt the thin chill threading into the carriage like a quiet reminder. She was drifting away from something. When she opened her eyes, the train car was empty. The yellow lights flickered once, then went out. A mechanical female voice crackled through the overhead speaker, distorted, unintelligible. Then silence. She bolted upright, heart skipping. Outside the window, a snow-covered platform, deserted, no sign of life. The doors were already open, as though waiting just for her, but no one was there to greet her. Her phone had lost signal. The screen blinked weakly. 12% battery. Leora stepped off the train, her boots sinking into the thick snow. No signs, no station name, just the wind threading through tall pines, and far off, the dim shadow of a forest. She turned to go back, but the train was already pulling away, the story turning a page without her. No pause, no return, the cold bit into her skin. She pulled her collar high, moving toward the only path she could see, a narrow trail leading into the woods. She didn't know why, but it felt like the only way forward. Not to return. To understand why she'd been brought here at all, each step stirred something buried. The times she'd stayed silent in meetings, afraid to be laughed at for speaking against the current. The manuscripts she'd read like voices she could never claim as her own, never once brave enough to submit anything she'd written herself. Snow blanketed everything, moonlight glinting through the bare silver trees. Every step sank deeper into quiet. It felt like walking into a memory long forgotten. Nothing but wind, until something ahead, faint, but undeniably there. A wooden cabin tucked among the trees. A single light in a window, flickering, like a stray warmth in a world gone cold. She stopped. Her hand hovered at her chest, trembling slightly, where her heartbeat no longer felt like it belonged to her. Something was shifting, not in the world but in the quiet, long-endured ache inside her. A crack had opened. Leora drew a breath, stepped forward. She didn't know what the door would open to, but this time she would knock and wait. The wind no longer howled, yet it still scraped softly against her coat like reluctant fingers unwilling to let go. Snow piled steadily, blanketing sound, color, and even direction. Still, a feeble yellow glow shone from a distant, worn wooden door, a weak heartbeat in an icy chest, not warm, but the only spark of life amid endless white. Leora moved forward slowly and resolutely, each step a hushed prayer. She paused before the weathered door, her hand raised but not immediately knocking. In that instant she felt a surge of uncertainty, as if she weren't merely approaching a house, but an old, sealed gate. Part of her longed to turn away. Yet another, long silenced by the fear of imposing, finally found its voice. She knocked, first gently, then with a determined rhythm. After a lingering silence, the door creaked open. A man appeared, tall, slender, with tousled hair and eyes darkened by a weariness that suggested nothing in the world could truly surprise him. Leora didn't yet know his name, only that his gaze carried a chill far beyond the winter's frost. For a few poignant seconds, they faced one another. Then he spoke in a rough, measured tone, not with anger or warmth, but as if reciting a tired truth. "There's no room for anyone here." Leora opened her mouth, the words caught in the chill of her throat. After a pause of several measured breaths, she managed, I'm lost. The train stopped at the wrong station. There's no signal. I only need shelter for the night. I'll leave at dawn." A cold draft slipped through the door as he regarded her, unmoved yet not utterly indifferent, his eyes a mirror of someone who had once known desperate pleas, now resigned to silence. Without another word he turned, leaving the door to close behind him. Inside, Leora stepped cautiously into the narrow living space. A modest room unfolded before her, a small sitting area with a few scattered shelves of books, an old unlit fireplace, and a wooden chair huddled against a wall. He offered no invitation to sit, yet she sank into the chair as if it were a familiar refuge in a strange place. Kalen, as she would later learn his name, stood a few paces away with his arms folded, his steady gaze neither warm nor welcoming. He switched on a lamp, casting a pale yellow light that revealed every line of their faces without erasing the underlying chill. "I have no extra food," he said flatly, as if to snuff out any hope. "No spare blankets, and the heater's broken." Leora nodded silently, a gesture well worn from years of quiet rejections. She turned toward the fogged window, watching the relentless descent of snow, a constant companion to her unspoken dreams. In that silence, she counted the slow, steady beats of her heart, striving to hold it intact against words harsher than the biting cold. There was nothing more. The air grew thick with unspoken secrets, like slowly melting wax around truths, too painful to reveal. Leora wondered whether she should have asked his name or simply remained silent, as she had so many times before. Her lips pressed together, guarding a small part of her heart against the fear of judgment, while her eyes followed a lone snowflake vanishing at the window's edge, a tiny dream adrift in the wintry void. Some nights, time itself seems to shrink, not because it is short, but because silence fills every moment. And tonight, the quiet was absolute. Now, faced with the stark loneliness of strangers in a desolate house, one must ask, if you were here, lost in a wintry forest, confronted by a man who would not extend help, would you knock again or leave? Forever. Share your thoughts with Leora. Will you stay nor depart? Morning crept in quietly, light slipping through the thin curtain and brushing the cold wooden floor with the caution of someone not wanting to wake the house. Everything remained still, as if no new breath had ever entered this space but the owner's. The faint dripping of melting snow outside the window was the only sound, a soft tick that reminded her time hadn't stopped, just slowed. Leora stirred in the dim grey light, unsure how long she'd slept. When she opened her eyes, the world around her felt suspended, like a threshold between two existences. She stretched gently, pulling her thin coat tighter, her bare feet meeting the icy floor with a quiet flinch. There was no scent of coffee, no stirrings of an early riser. The kitchen sat in darkness, its sparse contents arranged with a kind of discreet order. Clean, untouched, unwelcoming. Leora stood for a long while, simply observing. It felt like asking permission to remain. She didn't know why she was moving, but her hands began to tidy by instinct, wiping the table, rinsing the spotless dishes, returning everything precisely where it belonged. Then she found a few potatoes, some winter vegetables in a wooden cupboard, just enough for a small pot of soup. Modest things, but to her they felt like a greeting, not in words, but in warmth. Steam rose from the battered pot, filling the cold air with a whisper of comfort. She stirred carefully, her hands trembling from the heat, or maybe from the quiet, unfamiliar exposure of trying. She wasn't used to taking initiative. Her gestures had always been quiet offerings, small translations of what she couldn't say, like a child who had learned early to earn her place through usefulness, not presence. She remembered school days, always sitting at the back, her hands hidden under the desk, lips pressed tight for fear of being wrong, being laughed at. Her classmates had called her the moving shadow. When she tried to make friends, she brought extra pens, spare notebooks, half a lunch. Her kindnesses were met with silence or tight, uncomfortable smiles. The soup simmered gently. She turned off the stove, ladled a portion into a bowl and carried it to the wooden table by the cold fireplace, the one that still hadn't been lit. Outside, the door opened with a soft creak. Leora startled, setting the bowl down quickly. Kalen stepped in, snow in his hair, road dust on his heavy coat. He glanced briefly at the kitchen, his gaze landing on the steaming bowl of soup. He said nothing at first. Then his voice broke the silence, quiet but sharp, like a blade that had been honed in solitude. "I don't need anyone cleaning my house. This isn't an inn." The words didn't shout, and they didn't accuse, but they dropped like stone into water, splitting her small, fragile effort down the center. Leora didn't turn around. She nodded, once, slowly, deeply. Her shoulders slumped the way one does when trying not to crumble. Her hand clenched the edge of her coat so lightly, it looked ready to vanish. She lifted the bowl, turned away, and returned to the wooden chair from the night before, not to eat, but to retreat into the smallest, quietest part of herself. She placed the bowl on the table and didn't touch it. Her eyes found the window, where snow continued to fall, soft, endless, indifferent to whatever heartbreak was unraveling behind the glass. Sometimes it takes very little, a bowl of soup, a glance, a simple act. But when it's refused, it can collapse an entire interior world. Leora sat still, once again the shape she knew too well, the quiet shadow, never in the way, never asking for space, only existing. But this time, she was somewhere no one knew her name, somewhere no one needed her, and the snow kept falling. The snow fell without pause, as if the sky itself was trying to hide something, unspoken wounds, unsaid words, or simply the longing to remain silent. The cabin wasn't large, but it was spacious enough to hold the quiet distance between two people sharing the same roof. Kalen remained sealed inside his own world, like a stone buried beneath layers of frost. And Leora, after that quiet breakfast and his words sharp as ice, felt herself slowly dissolving into the hush, into that space that was neither near nor far, simply apart. She asked nothing more, sought no reason to stay. All day she sat, still scribbling now and then into her notebook, thin, brittle lines like winter grass. "I shouldn't be here. I've never really been wanted anywhere." She didn't write to remember. She wrote not to disappear completely. When the sun dipped behind the mountain, its light smearing like pale chalk across the sky, Leora stood, pulled on her coat, and stepped outside. She didn't mean to go far. It was just an impulse to leave a place that had no warmth for her, even if the cold outside bit deeper than anything inside. The snow reached her ankles, swallowing every trail, every trace. She didn't know the way back to the station, but that didn't matter. What she needed was space, to breathe, to retreat quietly where no one would see. Each step dragged with the weight of a heartbeat too heavy. Her breath came in clouds, while sorrow pooled silently in her fingers, cold and stiff. She tried to picture the path, but the forest stretched on, white and blank, without signs or turns. Just white. A white that erased not only direction but emotion. She walked faster, as if she could outrun herself, but her foot slipped. A brittle branch cracked beneath her, sharp as the sound of something breaking inside. She fell, her hand striking the frozen earth, sharp, cold pain. She tried to sit up, but her vision swam. She didn't know if it was the cold, the fatigue, or the ache that had built quietly since the night before. The sky wasn't yet dark, but the light was thin, indistinct. Leora sat back against a tree, her coat trembling in the wind, her eyes closing between shallow breaths. She wished just for a moment that she could sleep, or vanish gently. Then came footsteps, light and certain, pressing into the snow like a blade through silence. Kalen. She didn't know where he came from, or how long he'd followed. She only knew that when he wrapped his heavy coat around her, the scent of old snow and damp wood filled her with an urge to cry. He said nothing as he lifted her, his hands cold but steady. Her heart didn't race, didn't panic. It simply stirred, and something soft opened inside her like a curtain drawn to let in warmth. She was no longer alone. He set her down near the fireplace and built a fire. For the first time, flames bloomed in the cabin, not just warming the air but revealing something about him. He was not just stone. He had once bled, once hurt, once remembered. As heat slowly reached her hands, Kalen stood behind her. His voice, low and unsteady, had lost its edge. "I was left in the snow once. Don't do that to me again." Leora didn't turn around. She watched the fire grow, listened to the quiet tremble in his words. Not blame, but something closer to fear. An old fear, frozen for too long, now cracking just slightly. People often think the coldest ones are the strongest, but sometimes they're just children once left behind in the winter, still wrapped in ice. And now, in this small house where snow piled high at the window, two people were no longer complete strangers. They didn't need to speak. It was enough to sit near the fire and let the silence say everything they couldn't. The fire had been burning ever since Kalen returned with Leora. It wasn't bright, but it held a steady warmth, like a quiet patience that had waited a long time to be rekindled. Leora sat close to it, wrapped in an old wool blanket he'd found in the attic, her legs still stiff with cold. She couldn't remember how long she'd slept after he carried her back, only that when she woke, the flames still glowed, and the man who'd saved her was still there. Not as a stranger anymore, but as something acknowledged. The space between them was no longer distance, though not yet closeness. It was like the pause between two songs, where each holds its own rhythm, but both wait to find a shared melody. Evening descended like a veil of mist over wood, and in the soft light from the fire, Kalen sat at the table a few steps away, pouring hot tea into a chipped mug. He set it down, not with invitation, but with a quiet push in her direction. A simple gesture, yet it drew a circle of safety around her. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked, after a silence long enough to feel permanent. His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't gentle either. It sounded like a question he'd once asked himself too many times. Leora pulled the blanket tighter around her. She didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised. She took only a moment to respond, as though the answer had been resting inside her for years. "Because I'm used to not being needed," she said softly. "But I still stay, even just for a little while, just to know I was really there." Kalen said nothing, but his brow tightened, like someone had pressed a fingertip to an old bruise. He stood, walked to the far corner of the room, to a small door she'd noticed on her first day but hadn't dared ask about. He pulled a key from a drawer, unlocked it, and motioned for her to follow. Inside was a narrow room, dust thick in the corners, nearly bare except for a desk and a few shelves. On the desk lay a leather-bound notebook, spine worn, resting perfectly in the center. Kaelin picked it up, flipped through the first few pages, and handed it to her. Leora took it. The bold print on the opening page froze her mid-breath. From millionaire to fraud, Kaelin Dawn disappears after financial scandal. She looked up, but he only gestured. Keep reading. The pages that followed weren't news articles, they were handwritten, precise, raw, and painfully real. Words he'd never sent. Attempts to speak the truth, torn up inside him before. They could ever reach another person. I used to think that if I explained it well enough, people would understand. But then I realized, not everyone wants the truth, and eventually I wasn't sure I wanted anyone to hear it either. She flipped to the final page. A single line. A voice doesn't go silent because no one's listening. It goes silent when its owner no longer believes in sound. She set the notebook down. The room was so quiet she could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood. You used to be someone who spoke for others, she said, reading aloud the story his silence had written. And now, all you want is to hear the snow. Kaelin nodded faintly, his gaze far away, as if something out there was fading. Not the memory itself, but the faith that once lit it from within. But Leora didn't fall silent this time. I'm not good at speaking, she said. I used to hate my voice, thin, uncertain, but sometimes I still wish someone would say what they know is right. Just one person. She met his eyes, for the first time, without turning away. And I want to hear your real voice. Not because I need the truth, but because you need to say it. Kaelin didn't respond. But in his expression, something shifted. An admission not to her, but to the part of himself buried beneath years of snow and silence. The fire still crackled low in the hearth, but the room felt warmer now, not from heat, but from something opening, a door slightly ajar, a voice not yet raised but no longer lost, and that for now needed no reply. The days that followed passed in a silence that no longer strained. It had softened into a quiet kind of companionship. The wooden cabin, still cloaked in snow and mist, looked just as it had when Leora first arrived. But now the air inside held a shared breath, a warmth born not from fire but from the presence of two people who had stopped hiding completely. Kaelin remained mostly quiet, yet now and then he let slip fragments of old stories, unfolding not with urgency but like leaves drifting from a tree. He spoke of an older brother who was once his closest friend, and then the one who placed his name in headlines. Of a blazing summer when he stood before a crowd, believing his voice could change something. But that summer also taught him. A distorted lie travels farther than a whole truth ever will. Leora listened. She didn't take notes, didn't interrupt. She listened with her eyes in the pauses between sips of tea, with the stillness of someone who knew how much courage it took simply to speak at all. There was something in the way she received his words that made Kaelin keep going. As if he needed to know his voice still existed, maybe not for the world, but for someone. One night, as the wind beat against the windows and snow swirled like pale smoke, Leora sat by the fire, holding her phone. She stared at it for a long time, as if wrestling with a part of herself. The recording button blinked, silently, a small red circle she'd never had the courage to press. She'd never wanted to hear her own voice. She'd been mocked for the way she pronounced certain words. A teacher once told her, "You should write instead of speak. Your voice gets lost too easily." And since then, she'd grown used to stepping back, editing others, hiding her own words like scraps too messy to be seen. But now, in a place where no one judged, she wanted to do something. Not to expose Kaelin, but to help him hear himself. The next morning, sunlight, rare and tentative, filtered through the misted window panes. Leora sat across from Kaelin, on the table between them, a cup of tea and her phone. "I want to record your story," she said, her voice slow but steady. "Not to publish, just so it doesn't disappear." Kaelin looked at her. For a long time. His gaze held no defense now, only the wariness of someone who'd once entrusted his truth to the wrong hands. But finally, he nodded. "I don't know if any of it is worth keeping," he said, "but if you want to hear it, I'll tell it." And so she began to record, The conversation stretched for hours. It wasn't an interview. No lights, no scripts, no list of questions. Just two people, one speaking, the other listening, about the things that had once been buried, denied, drowned out by the noise of the world. Kaylin spoke in a low voice, sometimes steady, sometimes faltering, sometimes trembling, sometimes full of quiet certainty. He paused often, lingering, at the edge of a sentence, gathering the will to continue. And each time he glanced at her, Leora simply nodded, not pushing, not rushing, just there, a silent vow. I'm still here. When the recording ended, neither of them said a word. But in that silence, something shifted. A breath shared, deeper, fuller, as if a door had opened and the air inside had changed. That night, after Kaylin had gone to bed, Leora stayed by the fire. She plugged in her headphones and for the first time listened to her own voice. Between his sentences, hers appeared, quiet phrases murmured into the space between. I'm still listening. I understand. And finally, if a trembling voice can speak for a brave soul, then I don't have to be perfect anymore. She sent the recording to an old friend, someone who produced a podcast about untold truths. No long explanation, just a single line. Maybe just once, someone should get to be heard clearly. Then she closed her phone, placed a hand over her heart. Her pulse still trembled, but it wasn't hiding anymore. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But for the first time, she didn't see it as a wall. It looked like a blanket. Soft, white and gentle, covering old wounds so they could finally rest and begin again. No miracle happened the moment the podcast aired. There were no bold headlines, no viral storms sweeping across social media. Everything unfolded in quiet, just as the story itself had been told, unrushed, unshouted. A gravelly voice played, over soft piano, pausing now and then with emotion, accompanied by a woman's whispering tone, her name never mentioned. But anyone who had ever felt invisible, misunderstood or wounded by silence would recognize it. They were being spoken for. The podcast didn't make noise, but it traveled gently, from hand to hand, from a best friend to a former colleague, from a single mother to a man quietly battling depression. It was the kind of resonance no metric could measure, but strong enough that those who listened sat still for a long while afterward, remembering themselves. Kaylin didn't respond to the press. He didn't post a thing. He remained in the wooden house as if nothing had changed. But one day in her inbox, Leora received a short email, no subject line. The sender's name was simply C, just one sentence. Thank you for hearing me like I'd never been buried. She read it again and again, as though each word carried the warmth that winter had left behind. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some things once said at the right moment are answered best in silence. Somehow that podcast reached the ears of a senior editor at a small independent publishing house. They sent Leora an invitation to help lead a new imprint, one devoted to collecting real stories, personal voices, forgotten truths. The series had a simple name, Testimony. Leora took 3 days to decide. Not because she doubted the offer, but because she realized the first thing she wanted to do wasn't to edit someone else's voice. She wanted to write her own. And so she began, not with a perfect introduction, not with chapters neatly arranged by theme. She wrote the way someone might recall a long-forgotten dream, haltingly, honestly. She wrote about a nameless night train, an unexpected detour, a cabin in the snow. She wrote about a man whose eyes had long stopped searching, and about herself, a girl who once despised her own voice so much she never dared hit record. But things were different now. She didn't try to write something beautiful. She wrote to keep those moments from slipping into oblivion. The days when snow fell and she no longer felt cold. The silences that somehow echoed louder than any words. And most of all, the first time she realized she didn't need to be perfect to be allowed to stay. Every word she wrote was a step away from her old fear, and when she closed the final page, she smiled. Outside, the city had turned to spring. But within her that winter remained, not as darkness, but as a white foundation on which memory had left its quiet, indelible footprints. Winter returned more gently than people usually remember it. No fury, no bitter chill, just a white blanket settling over all that had been left unsaid. Snow fell in soft waves on rooftops, cloaking the forest, wrapping even the narrow path. That led into the remote mountains where a year ago Leora had once been lost, or perhaps had been guided by a chapter that needed to be lived. This time, she wasn't lost. She had booked the ticket, packed her bag, brought along a thick manuscript with a hand-bound spine and a black ink pen. On its cover, the title stood quiet and clear, Voice in the Snow. No bold author name, just a single line beneath, from two people who once didn't dare to speak. Leora walked through the familiar woods, each step pressing gently into the snow like a memory resurfacing. The path no longer felt foreign, though it still held its hush. When the cabin came into view through the white veil, her heart quickened. Not from nerves, but from the recognition of something in her that had never truly left. The door was unlocked. She knocked 3 soft times, then let herself in, as if the distance that had once stood between them had long since been set down. Kaelin stood near the fireplace, leaning slightly, one hand resting on the edge of the table like he'd been thinking something halfway through. He turned when he saw her, not with a smile but with eyes that had changed, eyes that looked at her like someone who had gone far and finally returned home. No greeting, no catching up. Just a small nod and the calm understanding of two people who no longer needed words to be understood. Leora placed her manuscript. On the table, beside it already lay another book. Its leather cover was worn, its brass corners dulled with time. On the first page, in careful, deliberate handwriting, one line. For Leora, the girl who heard me. She didn't move. Not from surprise, but because those words held a quiet tenderness that needed no proof. A recognition, a thank you, a year-long silence turned into a gift. They didn't hug, didn't hold hands. But Leora pulled out a chair and sat across from him. She opened her manuscript, turned to the first page and read aloud, "This time I will be the one to write my own voice." Kaelin didn't speak. He only looked at her for a long time with eyes soft and deep, like snow settling against the glass. Neither of them mentioned staying or leaving. They didn't need to. What mattered most had already happened. Voice had been offered, and it had been received. A soft breeze brushed the window pane. The fire gave a quiet pop, like the final period at the end of a chapter, and maybe the first breath of something unnamed. 2 books rested side by side, on the old wooden table, hers, 2 voices that had once gone unheard, now resting quietly together, in winter, in silence, in the warmth of a fire no one needed to guard anymore. And outside, the snow kept falling, slowly, deeply, as if the world itself were answering. Those who dared to speak again. Have you ever tried to speak only to shrink away, thinking your voice wasn't worthy of being heard? If Leora's story touched something in you, like to lend your strength to others still learning how to speak their truth, and subscribe to help build a space where every voice, no matter how quiet, is enough. Because sometimes, the most healing thing isn't being answered, it's being heard. It's